I think we can begin now. Thank you everybody for coming. We really appreciate it. I'm going to start by introducing the speakers and giving a little bit of an overview of what we're going to be talking about. So first of all, I'd like to thank Dr. Jason Wozniak and Dr. Donna Murch for joining us. So as a little bit of context, as everybody here probably knows, the administration of William Paterson has been planning to fire a number of professors and staff members as a way to deal with the deficit that the university is facing. We think that that is unacceptable, and we want to do everything we can to stop that. So the purpose of this meeting is for everybody to learn why the university, first of all, is in this situation, and why it's so easy for them to simply decide to fire people as a solution to the crisis, and why other possibilities and other measures aren't really being considered or proposed by the administration, because obviously other people are proposing alternatives. The situation relates to bigger systemic issues. It relates to the neoliberal, I guess, ideology, policy, system in general. We're going to be talking a little bit about how the university and how public universities in general have been started to be managed as corporations. The role that bank financing has in that, how all of this relates to important things to students like student debt and high tuition. And also, the other purpose of this meeting is to try to gather student support for our teachers and to try to organize students against the layoffs. And it all starts with, being well informed. I'd like to introduce the speakers. The first person that's going to speak is Dr. Jason Wozniak. He's from Westchester University, and he has a project called the Latin American Philosophy of Education Society. He's also been participating in the University Debt Reveal Day. And he's going to tell us a little about neoliberalism, institutional debt, and alternatives to our current system. After that, Dr. Donna Murch from Rutgers University, and she also has a project called Rutgers Freedom School. She's been very involved in the organization of Rutgers University against their own crisis, which is very big, and the layoffs have been, humongous. And she's going to talk to us about her experience organizing Rutgers, and as an example to us, how does organizing look? What are the achievements that they have accomplished, and the difficulties, and etc. And after that, we're going to be we're going to have time for questions and some discussion. And I think that's it. So without further ado, I'll let Dr. Wozniak give his presentation. Thank you everybody again for being here, and thank you very much for our speakers for doing this with us.
All right. First off, thank you, Alberto, for the invitation. And it's It's an honor to be here on a panel with Donna Murch, who we have a friend in common, Astra Taylor, who works with the Debt Collective, who has told me for years about Donna. So this is a big thrill of mine. It's also a real pleasure to be able to talk with the Student Socialist group. Not very often that happens, at least where I'm at. So this is great. And it's a rare opportunity. I also want to say just really quickly that I'm also an organizing member with a group called the Debt Collective. I'm going to put the link in the, I don't know if I spelled that right, but so that's in the chat. The reason I bring that up is because when we get to maybe talking about like what are our options or what is to be done, I do hope that we have time to talk about the formation of the first debtors union in the nation that we are putting together and establishing across the country as a way to build power, better power to fight back against some of the things that we'll be talking about today. I do want to say that listening to Alberto give the introduction, I think a lot of what I'm going to talk about today has to do with more of the systematic, larger issues, and then hopefully through conversation we can zero in more specifically to the local, the particular, and talk about your situation at William Paterson and maybe some other places as well. And from there, we could talk about strategy and tactics and so on and so forth. So I will give a short talk, show some slides, but please feel free to like leave questions in the chat, interrupt at different points, and we can try and make this as conversational as Zoom allows. So I'm gonna get started then. And I just want to say that it's really important that this event is organized by a student faculty coalition. And I think that over and over again, I want to stress that faculty needs to build coalition with students rather than management in order to build class solidarity. And so I think the fact that there are students and faculty working together is very important. I also want to give a shout out to the Solidarity Caucus that's on your campus, doing really important work within the union to build a union that will fight for some of the changes that I think we're going to talk about today. So lots of props to all the comrades in that struggle. So I want to begin my conversation with some framing, and to do that I'm going to draw on a Brazilian philosopher. So I used to live in South America and I lived in Brazil for a long time. So I'm going to draw on a Brazilian philosopher named Marilena Chauí, and also I'm going to draw on some Americans that maybe some of you are familiar with, Samuel Bowles and Herbert Gintis. And the reason I'm going to do that is because one of the things that Marilena Chauí talks about in her book about the university, and she's talking about Brazilian universities, but I think this applies in many other places as well, is that we need to always remember that universities are not a separate entity in the societies in which they are found. They're not islands. And the structures of universities, their social relations or the social relations we find in them, the way they're governed, are deeply influenced by the society that creates them and the society that funds them. So one point that I'd like to get across today is that universities are a reflection of a neoliberal and racial capitalist society in which it is in. And I think this is something that in a larger conversation we would have to somehow address, right? Like, how is the university reflecting certain social relations in the society, the political economy that we're in? And what would be the possibilities of having different types of social relations within the university that we want to see? And how do we develop that? What do we do for that? So just as a real quick refresher, I think a lot of folks here probably are aware of this already, but I do want to just put a couple terms on here if I can share my screen. So again, you know, neoliberalism, I think a lot of people in this room probably have a good idea of this, but you know, it's a dominant ideology, but it's also a dominant practice. Roughly stated, you could say it starts in the 70s and really picks up in the 80s and moves on. We're in a neoliberal era, although some people say it's coming to an end, perhaps. We could talk about that. But this is this idea of like the person should be an entrepreneur. Students are and others are human capital, have to be cultivated as such. Free markets and lack of government intervention are good things according to the neoliberals. And in fact, the government should only protect private property and set up the conditions for capital to work as efficiently as possible. And that means removing regulations, so on and so forth. So it's a very business-friendly policy, obviously. The other thing, and I think Wendy Brown makes this point very clear, is that neoliberalism involves the commodification of almost all aspects of life. In other words, these market-based principles and ethics starts to seep into all the areas that we inhabit, including schooling and education, even family relations. Moreover, neoliberal policies include tax cuts for the rich, a tax on unions, decreased spending on public goods like public universities. So that's a quick review. Part of this that I want to talk about is really important, and this is from Wolfgang Streeck. And he argues that during the liberal era, we see a shift from a tax state to a debt state. And basically what that means is that instead of financing our public goods through taxes, as tax revenues decrease, we become increasingly reliant on debt to finance a lot of the things that we would count on, including education. So when you hear this argument, well, there's not enough money, you should immediately say, well, if there were higher taxes, would there be enough money? That would be one response. But overall, you can see a shift, and this is in the United States, but also in other parts of the world, where you used to pay for things for public goods through taxes. And as the tax revolts led by Reagan and others start to work, tax revenues go down. And then you get not only individuals, but also people starting to pay for public goods through debt. So you get individuals and the universities or public institutions paying through things through debt. So this would be broadly conceived as a shift from a tax state to a debt state. The last slide I want to show most immediately is, I think it's really important that when we talk about capitalism, that we talk about racial capitalism. And this idea here is that capitalism is racial capitalism, that racism and capitalism are inseparable. A couple notes on this, and there's a lot to say by many great scholars on this, Robin G. Kelly, Cedric Robinson, and others. But for capitalism to work, it has to take wealth from one group to transfer it to another. And one way to quote unquote justify this transfer of wealth is by creating the fiction of race. So capitalism depends on the establishment of hierarchies based on race that justify unequal distribution of wealth and power. And historically, white males have controlled significantly more wealth and power in our country, as a lot of you are well aware of. So this just is to highlight some of the key factors, or the larger political economy that our universities are in, right? And this is also to say that this kind of challenges the notion of an autonomous university. And what I want to say by that is that we need to ask this question, like, who is the university, or what is the university responding to? Is it responding to certain types of government? Is it responding to markets? Is it responding to people, so on and so forth? Is it responding to donors? And what I want to talk about is that it's more and more responding to creditors and Wall Street. And that this leads to a lot of the problems that I think you're talking about here at your university, but that we're talking about across the country, is that more and more credit rating agencies and creditors that own the debts of universities like William Paterson are shaping governing policies at your institution. And so this is a key question. And it leads to this question of, like, how does who the university is responding to shape the power in universities? How does it shape to the way that universities are governed? Like, who gets to decide about these important decisions around budgets, around programs, so on and so forth? And I think within our neoliberal racial capitalist society, we need to remember that even as it is right now, our educational institutions, the prerogatives of capital and the imperative of profit end up rendering US schooling what it is. And so I think this is something that I want to hopefully challenge with you all. So how does this start to look, and how do we get to this point where today, in the neoliberal racial capitalist society, in the society that has shifted from a tax state to a debt state, what I want to say is that we have two different but related university debt crises. Okay, so there's two related but obviously different university debt crises, and this has tremendous impacts on all of us. So the two crises are the student debt crisis and the institutional debt crisis. And what I want to talk about is how these are related to some common things. So the first thing to keep in mind, and I'm going to share my screen here again, is that in this country, we continuously see massive cuts to state spending on education. So this is kind of hard to see, but I can point out New Jersey is right here. What you see here is state funding for higher education, well below pre-recession levels. And this is from 2000 to 2008 to 2018. And my state, Pennsylvania, is way up here. So we have a 30, all this red is like the drop in funding. So my state, 34%. New Jersey has a drop of, I think it's 23%. So this is continuous declines in the amount of money that states are giving to education, right? And that's really important because to make up for that, one of the ways that universities are counting that is jacking up tuition. So these cuts in state funding are being borne on the backs of students. And so here you see, these are the increases in tuition across the country. In Jersey, I think is down here at like 18%. I can send you this document later. So the increase in from 2008 to 2018 was around 19% in New Jersey, and in other states it's different. So again, you get this cut in state funding. To make up for some of those cuts, you see these continuous increases in tuition. That leads to, in part, a student debt crisis, because to make up the difference, students, to pay for the higher tuition, students have to go into debt because they can't afford the rising costs. But also really important is that as the funding for the universities is dropping, you get this creation of an institutional debt crisis, meaning like your university is in debt. And between 2003 and 2016, institutional debt at public and community colleges more than doubled, from $73 billion to $151 billion. Not only that, but the interest payment on the money owed by institutions also doubles. So broadly speaking, and I think we would have to update this obviously a little bit, the university debt is anywhere between $150 billion to $200 billion. Okay. So key points about that I want to just highlight here. What does that mean? So we get these cuts in funding, we get increases in tuition, we get increases in student debt, we also get an increase in institutional debt. So some key points about each of those. First would be the student debt crisis. We know that there's 45 million people or more in student debt. It's around $1.8 trillion. We know that this is a racialized crisis. Black and Latinx folks borrow much more than white folks. In fact, more than 70% of Black students go into debt to pay for higher education, compared to 56% of white students. 1/3 of Black bachelor's degree graduates borrow $40,000 or more, compared to 18% of all graduates. It takes longer also for those populations, BIPOC populations, to pay back their loans because of a racialized job market. Not only, this is also a gendered issue when you consider that 66% of the $1.8 trillion of the student loan debt is held by women. So 2/3 of that student loan debt is held by women. This also is a problem because of the gender pay gap. And so it takes women longer to pay back the loans because they make less on the job market. One could start to talk about things like predatory inclusion here. So you get more BIPOC students included into the university, but under terms that are very predatory. In other words, to enter into the system, these populations have to take on massive debt loads that are completely unsustainable, that will never be paid back. We need to remember that college in this country, public universities, used to be basically free. CUNY up until the 1970s, University of California, we can name others. But when they were free, they largely served a white male middle and upper class population. And it is no coincidence that as that starts to change post-World War II, civil rights movements, the movements in the 1960s and 70s, and as the population of the university starts to change, that's when you start to see, I think, a real strong pushback by Ronald Reagan and other people to decrease the funding. And so one of the ways, and Melinda Cooper talks about this in a really powerful book of hers called Family Values, but one of the ways that the Reagan administration and other neoliberals promoted a tax revolt in California that then spread in other places was along racist lines. And so one of the arguments they use is, and they're making this argument predominantly to white voters, was that why are you paying for these minority students to study at a public university for free? Not to mention, why are you paying for these privileged students to go to a university and lead protests and engage in trouble and so on and so forth? And so, you know, in many respects, their argument wins. I mean, you see massive cuts to revenue in California and other places as part of these debt crises. And so university used to be free until you might say it becomes more inclusive. You see these massive cuts, we end up in this debt situation where we're in today. The other thing that I want to say, though, is what does this mean, these cuts, for the other debt crisis or the institutional debt crisis? So again, these cuts to funding to public higher education have also made universities more reliant on debt financing for operations. And if you don't mind, I actually want to read a couple paragraphs from a piece that we just finished. So myself, Eleni Streamer, Rich Levy, and some other folks have been doing work on this, and we're going to publish a piece in The Nation. I think it's going to come out in a couple of days, but I'd like to read just a couple paragraphs about university debt in general that sum up really well the situation in terms of institutional debt. So when we talk about university loans and the money that universities themselves owe, we need to remember that these are not innocuous sources of financing for our institutions. The legally binding debt service obligations stipulate that repayments must be an institution's first budgetary priority. So debt covenants constitute powerful drivers of university austerity, meaning like when there's a budget, the creditors get first dibs on the money. So when institutions encounter financial trouble, especially during like global pandemics like now, they must respond first and foremost to their obligations to creditors before addressing the needs of the educational communities they serve. Over the past year, for example, colleges and universities have experienced dramatic cuts, including program eliminations, faculty and staff layoffs, and furloughs, along with tuition hikes in some places. Meanwhile, universities continue to pay their creditors millions in interest and fees. And so the creditors never have to take a cut. That's really important to emphasize. But institutional debt is not only about dollars and cents, it is about power. Debt financing creates an asymmetrical power relation between creditors, or big banks, and debtors, colleges and universities. And this relationship subjects public higher education to free market evaluations of a school's risk and value, often reinforcing racist and classist ideas. Because securing funds depends on an institution's credit rating agencies operate as universities' shadow governors. This is a really important point. These private financial institutions are anything but democratic. They are not elected or even appointed by elected officials. Their chief concerns are not the public good, but rather returns on investments. And from the vantage point of credit rating agencies, tenure systems, strong labor protections, and legislative control of tuition are not democratic treasures, but red flag liabilities. They may endanger an institution's ability to repay creditors. So, absent a sustainable source of public funding, credit ratings are financial lifelines. And this creates a perverse incentive for the universities to comply with credit rating agencies' demands even though they subvert universities' public missions. That institutional debt is seldom brought to public attention might help explain why efforts to fight draconian austerity measures in higher education so often fall short. And while tuition hikes and administrative bloat have been correctly politicized, the question of how institutions themselves are operating on debt is virtually unknown to most. And so we really need to talk more about this. So just a couple key takeaways about university institutional debt. And what I want to say here is that when you think of a university budget, or any budget for that matter, you need to remember that budgets are moral documents. And so in a sense, this reflects the ethical and moral commitments, you might say, of the place in which you are, or the country or the state or the city that you're in. So a couple political considerations about university debt. Again, remembering that the creditor-debtor relation is almost always asymmetrical, meaning the creditor is going to have power over the debtor. The only way to fight back against that is that if you have a mass number of debtors that can force demands on the creditors. That's the need to build debtor power. Debt is also, and this goes both for individuals and institutions, debt is a disciplining apparatus. It shapes conduct, it shapes what we can or can't do. And the relations between creditors and debtors are also extremely undemocratic. Creditors can dictate terms of agreement and enforcement. This would make things like shared governance a faintly recognized within university creditor-debtor relations. So if your credit rating agencies or your creditors are calling the shots, then that shoots a lot of holes in what we might call shared governance. So, and then part of that is because faculty and staff and students don't get to participate in discussions about the debt that your university owes. I would imagine that if you could, you would probably say, there's no way that we should be paying our creditors millions of dollars during this crisis while we're still laying off or furloughing or cutting programs. If you had a vote in that, I would guess you would vote against that. You would tell Wall Street, we're not going to pay you right now. We're going to save our people first, or we're going to save our programs first. But that's not how this system's set up. So this leads to these moral and ethical considerations that during this crisis, we should be asking, I think, one simple question. Who should our universities be responding to? What obligations should they prioritize? Those to creditors or Wall Street, or those to faculty, students, staff, and university community? And the problem is that in most debt agreements, there are debt covenants that stipulate that creditors, again, I already said this, have first dibs on available funds. So we need to do something about that. And that means that during these moments of austerity, universities are contractually obligated to respond first to the desires of creditors rather than to the needs of its members. And so when a creditor or a credit rating agency says, make cuts to pay us to satisfy our accountability measures, university boards of directors all too often oblige by asking, how much should we cut? Where should we cut? And then they defend those cuts according to market rather than social ethics and logic. This whole idea of like, there's a certain ethic and a logic that says, well, that's just how you do business. But I also want to say some educational outcomes of this is to say that debt is highly miseducative, or to state this differently, we could say, as one of my colleagues does, that debt causes instructional harm. This is to say that when creditors and credit rating agencies have as much power as they do over university budgets, their decisions corrupt educational experiences. Burdening students with debt, lowballing faculty salaries, cutting academic programs are all decisions made to appease creditors that transfigure educational experience. In short, debt-inspired austerity is bad for teaching and learning. So a few closing thoughts, or what do we do? I guess on one level, my argument would be that at every level possible, we need to decrease our reliance on private funding for universities and challenge the power of credit rating agencies. One way to do this is both to provide an infusion of federal funding for public higher education, and if universities are in need of credit, you make the federal government, not private entities, the lender of first resort. So this gets kind of wonky and technical, but I think it's worth stating. In other words, we would need to rethink and reshape the pandemic-inspired municipal liquidity facility for higher education. And I can talk more about that in Q&A. Importantly, however, as socialists, and I'm just going to assume for a second we're all socialists, we need to ask some other questions. We need to know, or we need to admit, first off, that the university is an ideological state apparatus. I think that's beyond doubt. Nonetheless, it is one, and even Althusser admitted this, that must be a continuous site of struggle. In other words, not only do we need to hold the line on austerity and fight for reforms like those from the Scholars for the New Deal for higher education are doing for more funding, but I also think that we need to think about pedagogical practices that help us counter-interpolate dominant debt ethics and logics. And these would be pedagogies that would help shape an oppositional debt consciousness. So in other words, the university could be, and I think should be, a place where we learn to form the critique of the debt political economy. Finally, and we should keep in mind the lesson that I think is passed down to us from Rosa Luxemburg, which is that to preserve, expand, and transform the current iteration of the public university is indeed a necessary reform, but also an insufficient one if it is an end in itself. This is to say that universities should be a terrain on which we begin to implement socialist educational projects, socialist governing practices, and socialist horizons that lead us past reform and towards larger structural transformation from a capitalist to a socialist political economy. Education at any level, of course, will not bring about a socialist revolution, but our educational institutions can be, I think, or hope, where we begin to imagine and hash out alternatives to the neoliberal racial capitalist society that we need to liberate ourselves from. And finally, keeping the etymology of the word apocalypse in mind, which means to reveal or uncover, I think it's safe to say that we're living through a higher education moment where neoliberal and racial capitalist underpinnings of higher education have fully exposed the question of what do we do now? And I think that's where we'll leave off. Given what we can see, it's up to us to decide how do we want to respond to it. So thanks, and sorry if I went over time.
Okay, thank you very much. That was a great presentation. That was very revealing. Now I'd like to allow Dr. Murch to give her presentation. So if you want to start.
Hi, everybody. How much time do we have? Because I want to make sure that we actually have time for discussion.
Well, there's really no set time limit for this. So I guess as much as people want to stick around.
Okay.
But yeah.
So welcome, everyone. I'm really sorry to hear what's going on at William Paterson. I look forward to hearing more. It's such a difficult time. One thing that I've heard in our union is that apart from the 3 Rutgers campuses, that the other public schools in New Jersey had layoff moratoriums. So I want to hear more about this, like the staging of the layoffs, when it happened, if you had a period of actual layoff freezes. So I'm going to talk about kind of the organizing that's going on at Rutgers and to think about it in a very practical way. And our response to this economic crisis and austerity in the short term and neoliberalism in the long term is doing coalition building between all different segments of workers. So I think for a number of reasons, this is one of the best ways to fight neoliberalism. And it's also a really important way of dealing with the politics of resentment, which I'm going to talk about more. When we have such a small percentage of the workforce that's unionized, that has benefits and security, it really creates a lot of resentment, especially of public sector workers. And one of the wonderful things that's happened over the last 2 decades or so is the development of a labor framework called bargaining for the common good. And it really came out of the teachers, nurses, and SCI unions. And the argument was that it's important to look at workers as having multiple identities, intersectional identities. So you're both your job category, the kind of job you do. You're also a community member who's physically located where they live. And of course you are, part of race, gender identity. So thinking about workers as having these multiple identities, and especially focusing on what people care about in terms of community. So that just flags kind of what I'm going to talk about. So neoliberalism in New Jersey. I could say a lot about this, but definitely the privatization of public goods. I like the way that Jason talked about it in terms of using Wendy Brown's idea of the commodification of everything. We're seeing a crisis of that in universities today because of the enormous student anger about the cost of education and the way that suddenly everything being moved online makes you realize that so much of what you are paying for is not the educational piece. It is the dorms, it is the athletics, it is all these other things that should be ancillary, but are actually huge in terms of university expenditures. So I'm curious, and I want to hear more in the question and answer period about how budgeting is playing itself out at William Paterson. At Rutgers, we use a budget system called responsibility-centered management. And essentially we've been doing that for about 10 years. It replaced all funds budgeting. And the kind of formal idea about responsibility-centered management is that each unit only expends what it has earned. So the way it's often summarized is eat what you kill. So the history department should take the revenues that it receives and then have its expenditures subtracted from that which it has earned. The problem with it is that we actually don't get to keep our revenues, that our revenues are determined by the central administration. So for example, the School of Arts and Sciences, I imagine might be similar at William Paterson, is the single biggest revenue generator. And that's another element. This is taking things that are, how do I put this? Things that are human, right? Like the humanities, like different schools, and then defining them only in terms of their economic significance. So in RCM, you talk about departments as either revenue generators or cost centers. So the library, which Rutgers has a terrible library, it is horribly funded. And under RCM, you have the central administration going to the library and saying, you need to become a revenue generator. The problem with you is that you're a cost center. And that had a series of effects on librarians. 40% of the library staff was laid off, even though Rutgers is an R1. We don't even have the Amsterdam News, the New York Black newspaper, before 1975. At exactly the moment that we needed digital access, it was being cut. So that gives you a sense of how, like, what RCM is. The problem is that we don't control the rules. And at Rutgers, 1 in 7 in every dollar spent is going up to the central administration. So this goes to their bloated salaries, their thick administrative layer, to give you a sense of how thick that layer is and how much money they're paid. The 312 top administrators at Rutgers make collectively $65 million a year in salary. That doesn't even include all the other ancillary benefits. So while they talk about cost centers and revenue generators, they actually set the rules. So we take in all the tuition dollars, right, as faculty and teaching and all the other workers that make that service delivery possible, but we don't actually get those revenues. They set the rules, and a huge tax is taken off and given to the central administration. So that's the first thing I would recommend in practical terms, is figuring out and talking more about what your budget system is and doing political education around that. I'm going to put in the chat, I put it in there several times, but in terms of organizing, we have a freedom school and it has multiple functions. One is to do political education inside and outside the union, but it also functions as a public archive. So if you're interested in seeing how do you do cross union organizing, which I'm going to talk about, how do you raise consciousness, how do you mobilize, that link at Freedom School, you can go through and look at all of our events that we've had. So it really is kind of a public document for organizing. And some of the individual freedom schools, we actually have readings that go along with it. We had a brilliant one with Jason's colleague, Eleni Shermer, who was talking precisely about the financialization of the university and connecting institutional debt. So, all right, so this is a terrible situation we're all in. Austerity, commodification of the university. And in our case, a lot of our debt is created by real estate development and by athletics. So if you can imagine, in the midst of the pandemic, when 5% of Rutgers employees, workers were laid off, taking away their health insurance and their tuition remission. We found out, we meaning the union and the Coalition Rutgers unions, that over $100 million had been transferred from student tuition into athletics. And we actually brought a lawsuit because we attempted an Oprah request, which is a transparency request, and they refused to give us the documents, so we took them to court. So a big part of the fight is also the fight for transparency and using your status as a public institution to do budget requests. And this is important for charting your strategy, but also for mobilizing your members. Nothing makes people more angry than that 312 upper level administrators making 65 million. Everyone in our union can cite this budget stuff chapter and verse because the specifics really matter. It's the specifics that move people, right? You can talk about it in terms of upward redistribution of wealth or expansion of administration, but when you tell workers who are making less than $40,000 a year, the salaries of the upper level administration, that really mobilizes people. So our vision about how to fight neoliberalism, and more generally this anti-labor austerity moment that we're in, is through creating coalitions of different groups of workers. So this started at Rutgers in the early 2000s. It started with our administrative director, Patrick Nolan. And the idea was there was a lot of activism around keeping down tuition. So you had this kind of, discussions happening with other unions. There was the founding of a group called Rutgers One, which was the way to organize undergraduates and connect them directly to the union. I'm just going to set the time so that I don't go over. Give me 1 second. I thought I had pressed play, but I forgot. So it started with that. And there was this kind of discussion of the unions trying to coordinate with contacts and share information. Then in 2005, our union joined, our AAUP chapter joined AFT, the American Federation of Teachers. And that was incredibly important. So I want to hear more about if your unions, if they're AFT or not, but that gave us a real capacity. We got monies in order to organize more of the workforce. So we were able to form a PTLFC to organize part-time workers. And very importantly, some of the other unions, like the Union of Rutgers Administrators in 2007 affiliated with AFT. So suddenly we had AFT, its resources, but also the umbrella of AFT. In 2011, we went through the largest merger in higher education history. There was no money allocated for it. And you had a merger of UMD&J, which was the medical and dental schools, with Rutgers New Brunswick and Rutgers Newark. So when that merger happened, suddenly Rutgers turned into this giant behemoth. And a lot of us opposed it because it entailed cutting loose the only public hospital in New Jersey, University Hospital, which some of you may know about. But while we opposed this at the time, it actually turned out to be a boon to labor organizing because suddenly we were sharing these affiliations through AFT and then either through AFT or through AAUP. So the first thing I would recommend is mapping out who all the unions on your campus are, what their affiliations are, and then figuring out how to knit connections between one another. So fast forward from the higher education merger to last spring, to the pandemic. So we already had these kinds of loose connections, but they had not solidified. And really under the visionary leadership of Todd Wolfson, who comes out of long-term community and labor organizing, very, very experienced labor organizer. And he did that work of knitting together this coalition. Zoom is part of what made this possible. People were at home, including not just the faculty and graduate students, but also a lot of the other workers at Rutgers, the administrative workers in particular. And so we were just meeting around the clock, constantly having these meetings. And we were coordinating things like contracts, figuring out what our shared interests were, and most importantly, doing the work of solidarity, telling each other, when people were laid off, and then the unions and the faculty and grad union, who in the case of the faculty have tenure, so we have permanent secure jobs, we did some of the heavy lifting. And one of the ideas that's really important in building a labor coalition is that it's the inverse of what we saw during the Cold War, where there's a period after World War II America that in some ways the most elite workers began to fight for themselves. It's called bread and butter unionism. And George Meany of the AFL-CIO was notorious. And it was the idea that you only focus on your own members. You don't focus on the people that aren't organized. And ultimately, that ended up being a lot of white male workers, most elite workers, and then just, doing nothing to help the others. And so what's happening now, it's not only us, we're reflecting larger movements within the labor movement. We're doing just the opposite. The idea is that the most secure workers will take on the risk that precarious workers can't. So kind of power mapping your campus and figuring out the tenure track faculty are especially important in this because they tend to be the highest paid besides the administrators and have the most security. So being able to convince them that it is essential that they see themselves as identified with all the different workers. And I'd be glad to talk about how you do that. So we had to work on kind of building and strengthening a sense of empathy so that people don't only fight for their own self-interest. All right, how do you do this? Well, the first is creating forms of lived experience. So I was involved in founding a freedom school for the union, and it really grew out of things that we were already doing. We did a lot of town halls, and you'll see that if you go to the Freedom School channel, Rutgers Freedom School channel. We did a lot of town halls, and some of them were incredibly powerful, especially in the spring, where we had all these workers, over 1,000 workers that had been laid off. And we had these longtime Rutgers employees, we had their children talking about what it meant to lose tuition remission. And it was very emotional. I mean, in one of them, half of us were almost in tears. And that's how both the people on the panel and all the people watching are able to hear the voices and see the experiences as other people in the campus. So you have to figure out how to build connections between people who see each other. You think about that relationship between faculty and graduate students on the one hand and staff. Too often staff are invisible. It was about trying to make everyone visible and especially to listen to the experiences of the most precarious and least paid part of the workforce. So I would recommend go look at the town halls that we had in March and April. And we came together. Another thing that brought the coalition together is that we used federal funding from the CARES Act that was allowing for something called workshare or Kurzarbeit. It was an idea that you would give businesses or institutions money, and all of the workers would take a furlough, which they would agree to, and they would be made whole through New Jersey unemployment insurance and then through federal CARES Act funding. So we lobbied the administration, and it gave the unions, all of us, all 19 unions covering 20,000 people, it gave us something really concrete to work on together. So that's something else that I would recommend. The best way to build solidarity is to have people working in groups and working collectively on a shared task. Long story short, the administration refused. We were very angry, but it gave us the moral upper hand. So when Jason was talking about how budgets are moral documents, because we did all this organizing, it began to build trust between the different unions. And fast forward to last week, we actually won a workshare deal that we're going to implement. So why don't I tell you about that, and then I'll open it up so we can have discussion, because I especially want to hear what's going on at William Paterson and then figure out how we can work together in solidarity. So we have a new president. Our old president, Robert Barchi, was really brought in just to do the higher education merger. He was very close to Chris Christie. And 10 years ago, he did a lot of appointments, kind of Christie era appointments. And unfortunately, many of those people are running the university. And that reminds me is that doing power mapping and figuring out who really runs the university. In the case of Rutgers, it's not the provost, it's actually the vice presidents. So the vice president, who is like I forgot his exact title, but he's essentially the head legal officer, and the chief financial officer, they're both vice presidents. The chancellor is largely involved in administration, and the president, depending on which president it is, our current president is not nearly as involved in the everyday running of the university than our last president. So mapping out who's the enemy, who are you fighting, and then figuring out where the real centers of power are. That is extremely important. So we, once again, when we had the second round of stimulus funding in December, we put forward a work share program, and we engaged in what some would call concessionary bargaining. So our union is deeply influenced by Jane McElvey, and I really recommend her ideas to you. She has a great book called No Shortcuts that we read in our union study group. And it's an argument about a kind of labor organizing that goes back to the 1930s, to the communist unions of the CIO, where you do something called a structure test. And it's a particular kind of organizing. We all attended strike school that was sponsored by the Rosa Luxemburg Foundation and was run by Jane Nelson. I'm sorry, that's a slip. With Jane McElvey with a special appearance from Sarah Nelson, head of the Flight Attendants Union. And we did it for a whole month together. 100 people from all different members of the coalition went to strike school. And so we learned about that kind of organizing. So I strongly recommend Jane McElvey's method to you. We've used it chapter and verse, and it has worked amazingly well for us. So fast forward to last week. We engaged in concessionary bargaining because when we did our structure test in November, we sent out an email and a survey to all of—
I can't do that in that app.
Oh my goodness, I have no idea what that was. Very strange. I do not use Alexa. I have no idea what caused that. So we did a structure test in November, and we wanted to find out what people were willing, this is in our faculty and grad union, what people were willing to do. Of course, we wanted them to strike, but they weren't willing. So tiny numbers of people were willing to strike. So that set our agenda. We had to know what the membership would do, but we nevertheless took an aggressive stance of fighting for the things that we wanted. And I don't think that we really thought that we could win them, but we did. And one of the main reasons we won it without even the threat of a strike had to do with a coalition. So, you know, what that represents to the administration, they're very afraid of strengthening the ties between all the different labor unions on campus. And I want to underline Jason's point, organizing with students is key. We haven't really done that yet in ways that we want to, because we spent so much time on our own labor coalition, but we see student organizing as kind of the next frontier, figuring out how to link that together with what we're doing with our labor coalition. So last week, we won a memorandum of understanding signed by the chief legal officer at Rutgers, saying that no layoff moratorium until January 2022. We fought for January 1st because that means that they'll have their health insurance and their tuition remissions through the end of the semester. And at the end of the semester is when everyone's contracts are up. So de facto, that was stopped. We won a successful graduate extension. As you guys know, grads are in crisis because they couldn't do any of their work. And we won a funding extension that is not entirely as broad as we would have liked, but we're the first public university to have that. The full-time faculty won back their raises. They tried to cancel our wages. I'm sorry, they tried to cancel our raises by declaring a fiscal emergency. We took them to court, and we used as leverage that we had pressed pause on arbitration. Now, I'll just say, labor almost always loses in arbitration. So this is a hard and expensive thing to do. But we combined that with pushing for these things that we wanted, really with the pressure of having this coalition behind us. So where to conclude? I just am utterly amazed at what our union has done. You know, I'm a historian of the Black Panther Party. I've been involved in all kinds of politics my entire life, but I've never been involved in a struggle like this, where it's a true collective struggle that is also bridging the class and status divides of the university. And it's very profound. When we just had a vote on our memorandum of understanding, and we had 1,700 people vote. Now, to give you a sense, 10 years earlier, when the union was being run by business unionists, the average vote was 300. So it's 600%. So I just want to stress this. You know, what's happening at Rutgers has shown me that there are ways to fight neoliberalism. And one of the biggest ways it's fought is the way that socialists have always fought things, through solidarity. But it's a combination of solidarity, but with very structured organizing ideas. And that's crucial. You don't have a strike unless you know you can win, unless you know you can get a super majority of 90% or above. In an anti-union country like the US, none of that is left to chance. So I'll stop there. I'm going to put again the link to Freedom School, because honestly, that contains all the information. You'll see the organizing in those events, and you can arrange them chronologically. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Murch. That was amazing. Thank you so much for the lessons and the ideas. Okay, we can open this up to questions. I think a lot of the, oh, I'm also, wait, I'm going to stop recording now.